Good afternoon, everyone. It's always really good to follow such a witty and light-hearted presentation with very hard and dense data, but that's what I'm going to do. So Theo, thank you very much for putting me on the slot straight after that. We're a global public relations company. We work with global brands, global businesses right across the world, so companies like GE, companies like J&J, companies like Shell. And one of the real challenges all of those companies have is understanding how do they engage in a radically changed world. And at the center of that engagement is something that's quite intangible, which is trust. You know, you're all sitting here now, you're tweeting away, you're listening to me, and you're all forming opinions. Do we like this guy? Is his presentation crap? Is it interesting? But it's all based on your opinion. And really behind opinion is that intangible thing, which is trust. So for the last 13 years, we've been looking at trust, and really we look at it on behalf of major businesses to understand how should brands and corporates engage in the conversation. So we do a study every year. It's called the Trust Barometer. We do that in 26 countries. We interview some 35,000 people, general public and opinion elites. Opinion elites are people who are generally interested in current affairs, interested in government, interested in media. And we look at four key institutions. They are government, media, NGOs, and one other, which I've unbelievably forgotten. Excuse me. Government, business, NGOs, and media are the main institutions we look at. And if I could ask for some slight assistance getting my slides back. Okay, sorry. So we look at that in the context of understanding influence and how do we rate those organizations. So briefly, what I'm going to talk to you about here is an overall look at influence and where do we stand. You know, we looked at that video about Facebook, and one of the questions asked on it was, what sort of a society do we want? Well, when we look at this and we look at trust, trust really tells us what sort of a society do we have. So I've gone through what the barometer is. We're going to look at key global findings. So that is the study in terms of what are the global findings in the key institutions we look at. We look at the state of trust overall, particularly in an Irish context. We'll look at trust in business and government, because that's primarily the lens which we look at it on behalf of our clients. And then interesting, given what the theme of today is about, we look at trust in sources of information. So who do we actually believe, and how are we going to believe information or trust the sources of information that are out there from media? That was the one I forgot, sorry, media. So do we trust the media? Do we trust sources of information? And we'll see a pretty bleak story about trust when we come to Ireland. So we'll also look at, well, how do we build trust? So we're living through an age of profound change. Technology, it's instant, it's in your hands. We're all communicating with each other. Influence is tweetable. We're looking at huge governmental change. Look at the US, the challenges the US has in terms of actually governing the country. Look at Ireland, look at the recent referendum. Why did the referendum fail? Was it because we didn't trust the government? Was it because we didn't trust the government's agenda? These are questions which will be debated for some time. But even look how governments are using technology to spy on their own citizens. Huge challenges there and major change. Then there's financial change going on as well. If you think about the traditional Western democratic market economies, it failed. It failed significantly, and it led to the very significant financial crash. And that has all influenced society and who we trust in society. So in the old world, we understood influence, particularly in my world where we're dealing with businesses. We understood influence in terms of a pyramid of influence, and that was that there was a vertical flow of authority. It was very controlled. So in a traditional model, the CEO, the board of directors, academics, such as those in this institution, would all have influence. They would speak, and there would be authoritative sources. There would be the elite media, traditional media, that would support them. And they'd push all of this information down at the general public. Still having problems with this. I have a love affair with these things. I did tell you, Sean. Great, thank you. So that traditional authority was there, but now there's also a new pyramid of community. So the old world of authority and push down is transferred and changed in that we have a general population which is very much a community-based source of influence, and it's pushing up at the general public. So you have the traditional top-down approach coming down, and we then have really a changed environment where we have what we call the diamond of influence. So you have that old vertical source of influence, but now you have much more community. You've got employees, you've got action consumers, you have social activists, all with a point of view, all communicating, and all influencing trust. So against that backdrop, we look at trust from a point of view of 2 points of view. First of all, we're very interested in reputation. From a business point of view and a brand's point of view. But reputation is slightly different to trust. Our view would be that reputation is anything that a business or a brand has done in the past. So why do we distrust banks? Well, we look at their reputation because they didn't perform the way we expected them to perform. So their reputation is based on their past actions. But then we look at trust, and to us, trust is a future-looking indication. It is what we expect an organization to do in the future, and how will we engage with that organization. So over the last 13 years, we've studied trust, as I said, and we have tracking data that is, you can see it there, from 2001. And really in the most recent study, we've seen a crisis of leadership, a profound crisis of leadership in the world, and that's going to be very apparent when we look at Ireland. So forgive me that I don't have the most entertaining slides and that they are slightly dense, and I'm going to go over here so I can actually see them. So I told you we looked at business, NGOs, government, and media. So in this slide, you see 3 years where we've aggregated the information. So we've put those 3 key institutions in. We've divided them into distrusters, neutral, and trusters over the last 3 years. You'll notice on the bottom left, there's ourselves. So 3 years ago, out of all the 26 nations, and there are 26 key global economies we look at, Ireland was the most profoundly skeptical country. We distrusted pretty well every institution. You move over to 2012, well, it hasn't changed significantly, but we're joined by other significant European economies who are distrusting as well. And then you move over to 2013, well, you see some of the other European economies have left us and they're becoming more trusting, but we're pretty well still in the distrusting camp. We're there at 46%, and we would always say if you're below 50%, you're distrusting. So Ireland is a very distrusting of the key institutions. And you would see then as well that the countries where there is established trust, look up in the blue area, they tend to be countries where there's strong economic performance. So in some ways, trust is linked to economic performance. There is a definite link there because we actually have tracked it over stock market indices, and when there's strong stock market performances, trust tends to be quite high. So just having a quick look at the global picture, you'll have to cast your eyes back maybe a year. There's some of the stories that people would have been talking about that would have been influencing who we trust and who we don't trust. So Lance Armstrong, Jimmy Savile, Francois Hollande in France. These are all of the things which would be influencing our perceptions of key institutions. So a quick look at the global picture of the 4 institutions which we really look at. So this is a global snapshot, and the blue bars are really the ones we should take a look at here. So government trust is at 48%. Governments are there to provide certainty. They create the economic conditions for businesses and the economy to perform. So governments around the world, people are not particularly trusting of them, but it's near 50%. But what's of great concern is the difference between trust in government and business. You'll see there business at 58% levels of trust. You would want those to be on a par, really, because governments regulate business, governments interact with business, and you'd want the relationship between the two to be fairly similar. Then you look down at media. Media is above 50%. Media has changed so profoundly. It's commoditized, it's democratized. We have high levels of trust in media, but one of the challenges with media is when we talk about media, what do we actually mean by media? And we'll look at that in a minute. And then the final institution we look at is non-governmental organizations. Consistently high levels of trust in those because they're seen as agents for good. They get involved in societal issues, and the charitable space comes under the NGO umbrella as well. The Irish picture, again, this is from this year's study. The current study, I should have said, is in field now, and we'll have new stats in January. But these are some of the things that were driving trust over the last year. These are the things we would have been talking about and tweeting about and having conversations about over the past year. So you saw the global picture a minute ago. When it comes to Ireland, you can see very same institutions being looked at. Government, very low levels of trust, 32%. Important to say that's not necessarily the coalition government. It is our system of government primarily. So it's local government, it's elected government, it's civil service. We are generally very, very distrusting of government in this country. Business, 44%, below the 50% mark, but still a reasonable level of trust. Media at 45%, I think it'll be more interesting when we get to segment that out. And then NGOs, that consistent story. So I just wanted to take trust in business and government and have a quick look at them, because if you remember I said a minute ago, it's a bit concerning that that diversity is there between the two. So I'm going to go back over here so I can actually read these slides again. You can see Ireland in green there, and I think there's a couple of interesting points there to make about Ireland. First of all, you see trust in government at 32% in Ireland. Look just to the left of Ireland and you'll see Japan. Japan, think about what happened in Japan over the last year. It had this Fukushima disaster, the Fukushima disaster. It had the government reaction to that. So it had a tsunami and a massive, massive crisis. Well, quite clearly, we had our own economic crisis and our own economic tsunami, and the levels of trust between the two countries are the same. I think it's also interesting that you see bailed out countries like Spain and Italy and Ireland also very, very distrusting of government in general. But the gap between trust in business and trust in government is as high, it is that highest level it has ever been. And when governments think about how they engage and how they win trust, that's a very, very significant challenge. So we've seen the level of distrust in the institutions. What about the people who lead those institutions? So we took a look at, well, what about a CEO, a business leader? Do we trust them? And we also said, well, what about a government leader? Do we trust them? And you can see that red line there is the 50% trust line. So what we're saying, pretty well globally, there is a crisis of leadership because people are saying that they do not trust the leaders of business and they do not trust the leaders of government. And that's a very significant engagement challenge. So now we wanted to understand what might be driving that or what's behind that distrust. So we asked some very focused questions. And if you cast your mind over on the top left, so first of all looking at business leaders, we asked, do you expect business leaders, or do you trust them to solve societal issues? Very low levels there. Right across the bar too, do you actually trust these people to tell the truth when they have difficult information to communicate? Only 18% of people in Ireland actually trust business leaders to tell us the truth. And if you're a brand or you're a business, and think about what we saw about engagement about Facebook earlier on, you've got a very significant challenge to get people to trust you. It gets slightly more challenging, unfortunately, if you're a government leader, because look at the same questions, look at the left. Can you trust government to solve the bottom left societal issue? Well, no, we're saying we don't actually trust government leaders to do that. And then right over on the right, do we actually trust our government leaders to tell us the truth when communicating difficult information? Only 14% of us do. So very, very significant challenges. Now, we'll have new data in January, but wouldn't be expecting the situation to have changed radically in Ireland. So we've looked at the institution, we've looked at the leaders of those institutions, then we wanted to understand, well, what is leading that distrust? What might make it up? And again, we look at the two institutions here. So why don't we trust business? And why are we distrusting of business? Well, you see on the top left there are two things, 57% corruption or fraud, and the wrong incentives driving business. So we're quite clearly very angry about what happened to our economy. We're very angry about how business leaders, particularly in the banking sector, were incentivized to drive their businesses. Over on the government level, well, what's really driving distrust? It's down there at 45% really is the key area, and that is poor performance and generally incompetent. I'm not trying to cheer you all up on the day of the budget, but it is a slightly bleak scenario. But out of all of this is insights on how these institutions should actually begin to engage. So we wanted to understand then, okay, we're distrustful of business, we're distrustful of business leaders. What sectors in the economy do we actually trust? We trust technology. We trust technology because perhaps it is very tangible. It's a source of inward investment into this country. There's very high-profile brands, many of whom are presenting here today. So technology, we're very trusting of the technology sector. We're reasonably trusting as well of the food and beverage sector. That's probably a reading on our own economy. We have companies like my own client, Glanbia, but Kerry Group, who are leading an agri-led export mini boom or significant boom in a part of the Irish economy. And then you go right down to the bottom, probably not surprising, you see banks are the least trusted institution in our economy. Wanted to understand a little more about that figure in banking, so we looked inside banks and asked people, well, why are we so distrusting of banks? And two things really added up to 60% of the problem, which was, first of all, corporate culture, that point about these institutions being given the wrong incentives. So corporate culture driven by compensation and bonuses, and also corruption. So two things are leading to extreme cynicism about banks in Ireland. This survey, the global survey, is launched at the World Economic Forum in Davos every year. When we showed the trust level figure to global leaders, business and government, when we showed the trust figure in Irish banks, I think 2 years ago it was 11%. The question was, well, who are the 11% of people who can actually trust banks in Ireland? So it was a fairly gloomy picture. Looking at how do we expect our institutions to solve these problems, we asked the question, well, do you trust your own government or do you trust the European Union? Look at Ireland there in the green. You can see, well, we believe our government, only 18% of the population of the survey trust government to be able to solve these things. Look at Italy, look at Spain. Clear link between the bailouts. Those countries who have had bailouts are extremely angry and extremely cynical about their own governments, and they're looking outside. When they look to government at all, they're looking outside their country for solutions. So we've looked at trust in the key institutions. I want to take a look at sources of information now. First of all, having a look at media. You see Ireland over there in the red box near the right-hand side. Media is a very difficult one to understand levels of trust in it because media has changed so much. But overall, our levels of trust in media are around 45%. But you can see, again, if you can take a look at the slides, countries where there are economic challenges, there is a level of distrust in media. And it's interesting to wonder, well, why is that? Maybe one of the things is that people feel traditional media didn't call the crisis soon enough, didn't talk to citizens about what was going on in their economies, or didn't understand enough. But we'll take a look behind that in a bit more detail. And I think this is probably quite interesting from the point of view of what we're talking about here today overall. So we wanted to understand, okay, media is very diverse, it's commoditized, it's democratized, we're all media, part of the media now sitting in this room. But look at traditional media. And Ireland is in the sort of grey area there in the first box. Traditional media, trust of about 64%. And you look at the global figure on the left there in blue, 63%. When we're going to look for information and look at what's going to drive our opinion and shape our perceptions, who are we going to trust? Well, in Ireland, we're going to trust traditional sources of information. So we are very trustful of the Irish Times, the Irish Independent, RTE, local radio. When we're making our minds up about things, we're still very driven by traditional media. We're also going to be, if you go to the next box, we're going to be driven by search and influence. And that's really interesting when you think about Google, for example, and search. Well, search is now a source of media. Search and media are pretty well the same thing. So we're going to look around online. We're going to find our own sources of information. We're going to aggregate that information, and we're going to form our own opinions. So reasonable levels, but below the 50% of trust in search. Then hybrid media would be the traditional media models that have moved online. In Ireland, irishtimes.ie, independent.ie, Huffington Post internationally as well. We're less trusting of those. I'd be very interested to hear the experts later on today and everyone talking today, looking at social media, significantly low levels of trust. You know, your opinion is as valid as mine as to why that would be so low, but maybe it's because there are so many sources of information, there are so many people offering opinion, that it's so diverse that it's difficult to actually fully trust. And when you're looking for information, you're going to go to very, very established sources. That's only an opinion. Owned media, 22%, not very surprising. I work for a corporation, Edleman. We have our own website. Would you trust my website? I'm not going to really put up impartial information. I'm going to be slightly biased talking about the organization I work for. So people see that bias, and they're more distrusting of a company's own media assets. But pretty well every company now is a media company. Every company can tweet. Every company can get engaged in social media, online. So every company is a media company. But we're generally looking at that as a population quite cynically and saying, well, that's biased information. So we've seen all the gloomy picture of who and what we don't trust. So who do we trust? Well, you can see over here on the right in 2013. I'm sure all the individuals from this institution, from DCU, would be delighted to see academics and experts. Really what we trust is independence, authority, and expertise, and a person like yourself or a peer. So from my point of view, when I'm dealing with an organization like GE globally, and we're looking at, well, how do you engage? Well, the CEO, if you look at the CEO of the levels of trust down there in Ireland, is at 36%. The chief executive of a company might not actually be the most influential people to talk on behalf of the brand, which is a real challenge because businesses and brands and business leaders are trying to figure out how do we engage in this changed world. And you can see academics have far more trust. A peer has far more trust. So regular employees in an organization are actually more trusted than the CEO. And that's a challenge when businesses and brands consider how do they engage. So nearing the end now, we've seen that there is a crisis of leadership. We've seen there's a lot of cynicism. So how do we begin to build trust? This slide is really more from a business perspective than anything else. Over the last 2 years, we went out and we looked at every trust study that existed, every white paper that existed, every academic study that existed on trust from a business point of view. And we wanted to understand what will drive trust in an organization. And you can see there in the top left, the colors. It is engagement, it is integrity, products and services, purpose and operations. So how the business or the brand engages with its stakeholders. The integrity of the business. Is it open and transparent? Does it have good products and services? Does it have purpose? Does it engage? Does it have a societal purpose beyond the profit margin? And then the operations as well. And I think what's sort of interesting about this, if you just look at the blue area at the top, the blue areas are engagement. And you probably find it difficult to see, but there are two words in the blue area, importance and performance. So we looked at what do people perceive to be important for business to deliver trust, and what is our perceived performance there. So if you look at the top, all these blue areas, the blue areas are engagement. So how a brand or a business engages is the most important thing to drive trust. So listens to customers' needs and feedback, very high levels of importance there, 67%. But we actually only think it's being delivered at a level of 24%. What's more interesting here is the gap between importance and performance right the way down. So you can see the gap there about actually listening to customers is 43%. Treating employees well, the gap is very, very similar. What's interesting about this is if you think about what would you think the purpose of business is, well, many of us would think that it's to deliver financial returns and make a profit, which is the third one there from the bottom. But actually, we found that only 32% actually think that that is the most important thing that a business can do. So if you're a business leader and you're trying to figure out how do I engage, you've got a very significant challenge, because if you go back to classical economic theory, the Milton Friedman model of business, the purpose of business is to make a profit. Well, if you're a CEO and many of our clients put this study at the center of their engagement strategy, you've got a very significant problem, because where you are challenged, where you need to be transparent, is around engagement and integrity, the blue and the green area there. They are by far the most significant things in driving trust in your brand. You also need to understand, well, if I engage in this conversation at all, how am I going to get noticed? How am I going to get listened? And a very simple thing about human behavior, we found through this study, 64% of people, this is pretty well around the world, not just in Ireland, need to hear information 3 to 5 times before they'll even notice it. So what does that mean? Well, we've looked overall at the sources of information we trust, the types of people we trust. We've looked at media and the areas of media that we trust. So if you're a business or a brand trying to get out there, you need to repeat your message multiple times through multiple channels. And finally, I'm glad I finally sorted out the problem with this thing, apologies about that, does this make any difference? Well, if you're a business or a brand, it does make a difference to your business, because trust has very, very tangible impacts on people's behavior. I saw a business in the community had a survey out this week which said the very same thing as our own study shows, that people will choose to buy a product or service based on the fact, do they trust a brand, do they trust a business? So by a margin of 85%, all of us will be motivated by trust. If we distrust, there's nearly an elastic relationship. 73% of us will refuse to buy the product or service of a company that we don't trust. Similarly, we'll recommend it to a friend or a colleague, probably online, and if we distrust it, it's nearly a very same elastic relationship. So trust actually has very, very tangible impacts on the bottom lines of businesses and brands and governments. So in conclusion, what's the message that we delivered in Davos to the great and the good of global business? We said that they needed to exercise principle-based leadership, not rules-based performance. It's very easy if you're a business to be guided by rules and regulations, but actually business needs to move beyond that and actually put principles at the center of how they engage with their stakeholders. And they need to recognize that it is no longer a shareholder world, which would be the sort of inside, narrow view of business. It is a stakeholder world. Recognize how we behave and engage is as important as what we sell. So not saying that it doesn't matter if your product is crap and if you engage well. Yes, you have to have a good product and service, but how you engage is critically important to driving trust. Transparency is absolutely critical to trust in the organization. And finally, there's very little point in a business if you're an insurance company and you want to go out there and talk about your latest product. There's very little point in having that conversation and trying to engage on it if your stakeholders have absolutely no interest in the conversation. So you need to listen to your stakeholders and decide what you're going to engage upon. So thank you very much. Apologies for the slight challenge I had for 5 minutes there. And sorry I had no witty slides like the Dara's ones. So thanks very much, everyone.